Okay, good morning. Good morning. Thank you so much for tuning in with us on this week's Led by the Word. Man, Elijah, I love how much of a smart aleck he is.
Yes.
First off, we got to say that. He is the most sarcastic, kind of a smart aleck prophet in the Bible. Is that safe to say?
I mean, that we know of.
That we know of, that it gives us his verbiage of how he acts. I love, honestly, it's terrible when he's up there arguing with those prophets of Baal. And you guys, we're going to touch on that today. You guys know the story of the 400 prophets of Baal? I forgot how many it was.
Have to look. It's kind of.
Anywho, so they gather up these prophets and how he's up there and he's arguing with them and he's like, well, if your God's so good. Anywho, we're going to touch on that a little bit today. First, I want to start out with Elijah and Ahab. Ahab, now, I was thinking this, but I had to look up to make sure about this. Ahab is by far the most terrible king Israel has ever had.
Right. The scriptures even said, like, he made God angrier than any other king.
Like Ahab is the worst of the worst. And it really, it shows you, like, we feel like there's so many new things happening. There's not.
Oh.
We feel like there's a terrible, fearful things happening on the news that's never happened before. Nothing's surprising God. Nothing has not happened before by this point in time. Ahab sees Elijah, and they're having this argument. And you know what Ahab calls Elijah? Oh, troubler of Israel.
Yeah. Like, he's to blame.
And we see this now. We see sinful, ungodly politicians starting to blame stuff on Christianity. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, oh my goodness, that shouldn't happen. That should never even be a consideration. What is going on? But it's nothing new. If you go back to the most sinful king of Israel's time, in his heart, he is blaming Elijah. And he's saying, oh, troubler of Israel. And I want to tell you something. The enemy, John chapter 10, verse 10. 9, 10, and 11, read those three verses. The enemy cometh not but to kill, to steal, and to destroy. And we see that in this man's life. And you know, the enemy is also, it tells us he's the father of all lies. There's nothing that's ever been, that ever will be more deceitful than Satan. And you see him working through Ahab with this massive amounts of deceit. So I know we all know the story of Jezebel. Mm-hmm. We're going to touch on that a little bit. Jezebel doesn't get much worse than Jezebel. Jezebel's as bad as they come. Well, let me tell you about Ahab. Ahab's pretty bad. Her and Jezebel are just like that, and I understand that, and they're these two peas in a pod. But Ahab is so submitted to his wrongs that not only is he non-repentive, he is 100% sure that what he is doing is right. So he's looking out there, and listen to this. I don't think he's up there having Satan in the ear saying, this is the bad guy. You got to let the people know. Mm-hmm. No, I think he's up there and he's 100% in the cause. He says, Baal's God. Christ is your God's false. Mm-hmm. So what you're doing is you're out here worshiping your God and you've caused Baal to give us a drought. So in his mind, he really thinks all the problems, all the issues, all this chaos is 100% on Elijah. And he said, we got this whole land of people in trouble, this whole land of people hurting. And that's what the enemy does. He mixes a little bit of good in stuff to disguise it. And we see that politicians will say, you know, they'll blame for this or they'll say for this, world leaders. And we're like, it's so obvious to us as Christians. We're like, it's so obvious. But they're blinded. They're 100% blind and they can't see it. I actually read this. I want to read this. A quote on Jezebel, I have to say. Jezebel was not content with a private chapel, nor with her husband's readiness to pay lip service to Baal. She meant to dethrone the God of Israel and make her Baal the chief deity and her faith the official state religion. And I want you to stay encouraged when you're looking around and you're like, goodness, it feels like the enemy's no longer satisfied just getting people out of church. It's like the enemy is 100% coming in a full spiritual warfare against God. That's just what's going to happen. That's the way this stuff progresses. That's the way this stuff goes. But what I want you to remember is there's always going to be a remnant. There's always going to be Elijah. There's always going to be a church. And the enemy is always going to lose. So you may think you're looking around, you're like, well, God, where are you here? Where are you here? And people can submit. We're free will people. We can submit to whatever we want to. Ahab, just like all these other kings, he should have went back to Deuteronomy chapters 28, verses 23 and 24. And what that says is that a drought would be on Israel in disobedience. And it was a promise of God. There's this factual tablet or scroll he could have went back and known. But in his blindness, in his ignorance to look for truth, in his 100% submission to the enemy, he said, no, I ain't going back to that. We see later, I've always thought we get the Bible and that's when the Bible come, when King James translated it. But King Josiah, he went back and read.
Right.
So Leviticus, they had this stuff that they went down and jotted down. So there was opportunity for him to know better. But instead, he's surrounded with someone speaking in his ear, just like Jesse said last week. I think it was last week you warned us. Who do you let speak in your ear? Last week. Who do you let speak in your ear when we were talking about, was it Joab, wasn't it?
I think so. Is that last week? Goodness.
Last week or the week before. So, okay, I want to go to another verse. 1 Kings chapter 18, and I have to read this one. Find it here in my word. Verse 21. It's one of those verses I got to flip pages. And Elijah came unto all the people and said, how long halt ye between two opinions? Tell yourself, halt between two opinions. If the Lord be God, follow him. But if Baal, then follow him. So he's telling them. Now, I looked up what did halt mean here. I love the translations. It means hobble. It means jump. There was actually a bird back then. And the phrase come from this bird because the bird, he would stand on one foot to rest. And then when he'd get tired, he'd just go the other foot. He'd go the other foot. And he'd go the other foot. And he'd go the other foot. So you think all these people are worshiping Baal. And I was like, they're not hopping between two opinions. These are Baal worshipers. They're on the mountain. So he yells this out. And here's the next part, the last part of verse 21. And the people answered him, not a word. And at first that super discouraged me when I read that. And I was like, oh, that is so hurtful. That is so sad. The people, they're silent in this. But this is actually the best part of the whole story. And I didn't even realize it. And it went over my head. And I was praying about this morning. These people, they're silent. And they're rejecting God. They're non-repetitive to God. They're not reaching out to Christ. They're not praying towards Christ. But you want to know something else? When they felt Elijah near in the presence of Elijah, they were done defending Baal. Their silence, their hopping back and forth, was put to a stop in the moment when Elijah stepped in the room. So I want to encourage you, you can be that Elijah that changes people's life. Because the next thing that happens, and I'm going to let Jesse tell us a little bit about this story, is how how God puts a direct stop to the prophets. And when the prophets are wiped out, then he's got a direct victory for the people. So the enemy's got all these lies, all this pain, and you can be an Elijah in someone's life that when you step in, all the lies of the enemy come to a stop. All that happens, all that's spoken is silence. And then next, after the defeat of the enemy's lies, all that is there is victory left for the people. Tell us a little bit about the rest of this story. I mean, it's unbelievable.
Yeah, and I think, too, one of the best pieces of advice I ever heard was that when someone has a riff with you and you've not done anything to them, a lot of times it's not you they have the problem with, it's the Spirit of Christ within you.
Amen.
And of course in the Old Testament it was a little different. God appeared, his presence was represented by the ark, he was the cloud by day, the fire by night. It was a little different than our situation now. But Elijah was definitely in the will of God. He was definitely one of God's chosen prophets, right? So when Ahab had this against him, I actually wrote that verse down too. It's chapter 18, verse 17. And it came to pass when Ahab saw Elijah that Ahab said unto him, Art thou he that troubleth Israel? And he answered, I have not troubled Israel, but thou and thy father's house, and that ye have forsaken the commandments of the Lord, and that hast followed Balaam. So I love how Ahab's like, you're the troubler of the land, and Elijah's like, no, it's not me, bro. It's you big time. But what you said, he was committed to the cause, it actually reminds me in New Testament, Saul thought he was right persecuting the Christians. He thought, these people are blaspheming the word of God. I'm a protector of the word of God. He literally thought he was on the right God side. That's when the Lord appeared to him and is like, Saul, what? Stop.
That's why when you're at these Christmases coming up, and you've got family coming in, and you've been fighting with this family of yours because you in your spirit, you're like, I've got God, I know what's right. I know what's wrong. I know the things they're doing is going to hurt them. I know their choices are going to be bad. Quit fighting with these people in verbiage.
Yes.
You're not going to accomplish nothing. Elijah yells back, it didn't do nothing. It didn't change nothing. Nothing accomplished. Everything that you can win in your life is going to be won in a spiritual battle. Because you got to understand, you're not trying to prove to them God's right. When they're listening to the enemy, there is no possible fact. You could come to them with Noah's Ark. You could come to them with the Ark of the Covenant. You could come with them all these scientific facts that are constantly proven creation. But scientists are still going to ignore it because of spiritual blindness. You know, we went to the Ark in Kentucky. And I remember I got food poison. And I was throwing up all day long. But I'll never forget this. We come to a thing. And Brother Ken Ham, the guy over the whole thing, the scientist, he takes this piece of ice to the scientist and he shows it to him and he says, how old is this ice? So they're looking at it and they're running it through their stuff and they're geodating it or however it works. And they said it's 3-point-something million years old. So he said, okay, how about this piece of ice? They said 3.2. And then they're staying in this roundabout range. And he says, this ice come from Antarctica off of a World War II plane. And then he shows them where the ice come from. Then he brings the plane. And he said, you're so focused and blinded by this stuff that you can't see how even unfactual it is. And, you know, we look at that as just one example of the science of they couldn't even fathom, they couldn't even process, they couldn't even think outside of their box. But it's the same stuff that happens in family fights. If you're fighting with a sibling, we talk to youth here, and you're in this argument, and you've committed your life to God, and then they're making fun, or they're being mean, or they're always saying what you're doing is a waste of time or wrong, you need to live like this and be like this. You're not fighting flesh and blood. And if you're fighting it as flesh and blood, you're doing it wrong, there's going to be no success. Because what Elijah could have done, Elijah could have said, let's have a table. Let's sit down, and let's argue for the next 6 weeks.
Right.
You tell me Baal's right, I'll tell you God's right. It's two people fighting with nothing proved. But Elijah took it spiritually. Now, we're no longer out here slaying prophets. No, but we can get on our knees. We can stand and pray. We can take time, and we can go direct offensive assault against the kingdom of the enemy. And we can pray about this stuff. You know, I used to just pray about, I don't know how to divide these two things, but I used to just pray about, like, God, we need a healing, we need a change, we need a fix. But now I'm directly praying against the spiritual warfare in people's lives. And you want to know, of my 6 check marks, one of them is that. And I've seen God literally move in a supernatural way in people's spiritual warfare and make impact. God ain't limited. God is not limited at all. And you better believe if one of his children are down here getting attacked by the enemy and they're succumbing to this, God can come in and fight for them.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's supernatural. We see it in Paul/Saul. You know, he came down supernaturally. That was crazy. So Elijah kind of presents this challenge to Ahab. So there were 450 prophets. You were very close, of Baal. And he said, let's do a sacrifice, right? Okay, so we're going to douse this altar in water and everything. And we're going to pray, you know, all day. And if Baal comes down and, like, lights it up, we'll know he's the real God, right? So Elijah has this confidence in God because he knows, you know, Baal is a false God. This ain't going to work out for them. So they do all this, you know, the Baal prophets get together and they're crying out and they're just like, you know, please answer us, please, you know, Baal, come on, like, do your thing, you're awesome. So what Micah was referencing with Elijah being sarcastic is in verse 27. It said, and it came to pass at noon that Elijah mocked them and said, cry aloud, for he is a god. Either he is talking, or he is pursuing, or he's on a journey, or peradventure he sleepeth, and must be awakened. It's so sad. The next verse it says, and they cried aloud. They were like, oh yeah, maybe he's right. Like, maybe we should cry louder. Like,
Good tips.
That's it.
Good tips
Yes.
and
Okay.
tricks.
All right. So, of course, nothing happens because, you know, Baal's a false god or whatever. So then they're like, okay, it's Elijah's turn. So he does this whole altar thing. He, like, the water's running over, you know, all this stuff. And so God, excuse me, comes down. The whole thing is on fire. And so they're all shooketh. And they're like, oh, my goodness, you know, this is the real God. At the end of it, he ends up slaying all the false prophets, right? Excuse me. So like Micah said, we're no longer in the flesh and blood thing. I was talking with someone a few weeks ago, and I said, when you hear the song or like you read in the Psalms about, you know, making a table in the presence of my enemies, I'm like, do you think of someone in the physical? And they're like, oh, yes. And I'm like, you're wrong. It's not. Your enemies are not in the physical. The New Testament tells us that we no longer fight against flesh and blood, but against spirits and principalities. So what Micah is saying is spot on. It's super biblical. We're not in that Old Testament where their enemies, the Israelites' enemies, were actual people. They were kingdoms. They were nations. They were people that were coming against God. People that followed false gods. That's no longer the case. You're not fighting with your relatives in the flesh. It's something in the spirit that is grieving you, or vice versa. They're feeling convicted because you're carrying the Spirit of Christ with you. So I would definitely encourage you to be like, okay, pause. This is not about me. This is not the physical. Like you said, it's the spiritual. And it does. It changes your whole prayers.
Well, we take this so personally because God's everything to us.
Yeah.
So then we step in it, and if we're not careful, we step in it with no longer just spiritually fighting for God. Then it becomes just an emotion. Then it becomes a physical thing, and you're just going to hurt the kingdom.
Right.
Then they're just going to say, well, I went to a holiday, and here's another reason I don't like Christians. They fussed at me the whole time. They told me how I was wrong the whole time. I'm challenging you. Let this be one of the best Christmases you've ever had. And prior, during, and after, all your fights, let them be done on your knees. Let them be done praying to God. Let them be done seeking out on people's behalfs. Because something you also can't forget, the people that you think are hurting God and damaging God, God still loves them. And He loves them the same tier He loves you. So God wants to fight for them, and we're just going to pray on their behalfs.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so, after this, the rain comes. So there had been a drought for 3 years, right? This was kind of what Ahab was accusing Elijah of being an issue with anyway, is there was no rain for 3 years. If there's no rain for 3 years, they didn't have the outsourcing abilities that we do. Like if you ever look on your bananas or your oranges or different things, it'll be like, hey, this came from this state or this came from this country. A lot of our stuff is imported from different countries. They didn't have transfer trucks, as far as I know, back then, or, quite the whole continent. Yeah, it was different. So their outsourcing was way closer. So after this drought, their resources were drying up. In chapter 17, we really didn't touch on, that was when Elijah was at the brook of Cherith, and that sustained him for a while. But then after, there was no rain, there was no brook. The brook dried up. And that's how he got connected with the widow woman, which I love when he gets connected with the widow woman. He's like, I need you to bake me a cake, right? She's full of doubt. She's like, I barely have enough. Me and my son are going to eat and die. I am committed to this death. So he's calling her out. And he's like, okay, that's fine. Just make me a cake. Well, after he makes her a cake, she has this barrel of cruse and oil, and it just overflows, right? They're sustained through the whole drought. It's amazing. It's a miracle. Immediately after, her son falls ill and dies. She turns around and accuses Elijah. She's like, have you come here to bring up all my sins that my son would be slain? And I'm like, this man you just saw a miracle. What is your problem? But we see that repeatedly in Elijah's story. If it's not other people accusing him, it's him accusing God. When he called out the prophets of Baal, he's like, I'm the only one that's following God. It's like, no,
no,
not even close.
There's always going to be a remnant.
There was a gentleman named Obadiah who was hiding tons of prophets, of the true God. Somewhere in a cave, he would sneak them food and water. Elijah was not the only one, and the Lord eventually did call him out and was like, there's a remnant, chill. So I think sometimes we get so caught up in our own things that, Elijah's going through all this and he's like, I'm the only one. I'm the only one doing the right thing. And of course, if you're thinking you're the only one, you're going to get super depressed and super discouraged, And I love that after, I'm not going to touch on 19 and 2021 today because I'm losing my voice. I'm sorry. But after he gets so discouraged, that's actually when the Lord brings Elisha into his life. And I couldn't help but wondering while I was reading that if the Lord did that as an encouragement for him. Your burdens are so heavy. Let's bring in another, follower of God.
I think also Elijah was super, super humbling because I'm the only one.
Oh,
wrong.
Sure.
God's like, let me just... Have you ever had God have to really deal with you?
Yeah.
God had to deal with some Elijah, just like the rest of us. And, we got to come to a closer. We have an appointment after this. But if you're ever in that thing, you got to understand, God works so gentle with us. Elijah is what I'm calling peak ministry. He's changing a country. It's a little cloud the size of a man's hand. Don't let it hinder you, Ahab. Ahab's like, okay, I'm going home. And then it says, now the sky's black, and when he literally brought the Spirit of God to the entire land. That rain is talking about His Spirit just flooding this place.
Right.
And it was an instantaneous thing. Then the next thing is depression and anxiety
Yeah,
and
almost
fear,
immediately.
like immediately after this miracle. Just like Jesse said with the mother and the son, the same thing happens to Elijah.
Yes.
So don't let the enemy get you so down that you forget, wait, God just brought me through something. God just brought me through something else. When I'm praying, we had a little scary incident with Kara the other day. And we was laying hands and we was praying, and fear was the first instinct. And I was like, goodness, I don't want that to be my first instinct. But my next instinct was prayer. And I said, God, you've done this. You've done this. You've done this. This is no big deal. This is no big deal. I don't care how big of a deal it looks in my eyes or how my fear is trying to tell me it's a big deal. God, you can do anything. And you have to have that prayer in your life to where, and then God will send you an encouragement, a chastisement, and a future with Elisha.
I like that. That's good. Yeah.
In here, let this be a daily prayer. God, don't let me hobble between opinions. Don't let me hop between opinions. Let me see your word. Don't let fear and anxiety rule in my life and my mind.
Amen.
Thank you so much for tuning in. Oh, you can't kill a promise. I'm telling you, there's going to be promises in your life, and the enemy hates those promises. He's going to try to destroy and kill those promises. You can't kill them. This book is still free. Pastor Keep says we're going to charge for it soon. That has not happened yet. If you'd like this book free, we'll put it on the screen. Easy to get. It just takes like 20 seconds, and we'll send it out the next day. Thank you so much. God bless you.
God bless you.